We're here to talk about value again, and the two sides of it being, one of them we'll get to cost in a second, but the other thing that is true for all the people up here have all had a hand in developing some really amazing cancer drugs. We've seen amazing new technologies. I think we've talked about this just about every year here, that are having just incredible responses in, at least in specific cancers. And we actually had there was some really amazing news last night in CAR-T, which we talked about with Joe, but a company called Bluebird Bio showed really impressive results in myeloma. Mark and Bob, you're both involved in this space. What should we be taking from these results? We've also had a bit of a scare around a company that you helped start, Juno. So where are we with CAR-T? Mark, do you want to start?
Yeah, so the data that Matt is speaking about is a small phase 1 study of using the CAR-T approach, where patients' T cells are apheresed, are engineered, and then put back into the patient, where the T cell will recognize a specific antigen. In the case of the data we talked about last night, this is called the B cell maturation antigen, or BCMA for short. What happened in this phase 1 is that patients who are highly refractory, so they failed essentially every type of therapy that exists for myeloma, responded exceptionally well. This is phase 1 cohort, of course, is looking for the safety of the therapy first, not efficacy. The interesting thing about it is that at the higher dose level of their cells, 100% of a small group responded, and not only responded, went into a deep remission defined by objective criteria. So the suggestion is that, without enough follow-up, but a small cohort, that this treatment could be analogous to a bone marrow transplant for patients who have no other options to treat an incurable blood cancer. The most important aspect of the trial, though, is that, as you mentioned Juno, and perhaps Bob would want to talk about Juno, it is very safe at this point in the development. So it uses conditioning treatment.
Very small number of patients.
Very small number of patients, and that's the caveat. Always the caveat is, let's be careful that we don't get ahead of ourselves. But it does seem to make a difference on process. This is what we were talking about off stage. And the antigen, or the target, with respect to immunology and T cell expansion, may also be very important. And I'm sure my colleagues Ken and Giovanni will talk about this issue of the PD-L1 or PD-1 ligand today. So immunology is this vast opportunity to selectively treat patients, activate the immune system, and in some ways, that leads to cytokine release syndrome and toxicity. In other settings, we shouldn't generalize what we think will happen. But we're early, it's exciting, and it is that kind of innovation that I think when we think about value, if this translates to the kind of benefit for patients where they don't have to go through a bone marrow transplant, or it adds to the therapeutic armamentarium, what's that worth for someone who otherwise would die? I also, Matt, need to say something because it hasn't been said yet today. 30 years ago, 35 years ago, we discovered the HIV virus. And today, we celebrate World AIDS Day. And I think the panel before us talked about short-term thinking. We have to remember that in the 30 years since this virus was discovered, and what we celebrate and recognize worldwide is how innovation has controlled the disease that otherwise would have wiped out cross-sections of the population.
Definitely.
We don't think about that today, but this is what we're talking about in the context of innovation, value, and how to think about the future.
So Bob, now the flip side of these therapies is they do have toxicity, and Juno has had 5 deaths in one of its trials, which a lot of people are upset about. You've been in backing Juno. You've talked about this as maybe the technology that you think could cure cancer. Where do you think we are now with CAR-T?
I think the Bluebird data, I'm an investor in both Bluebird and Juno, so I think the Bluebird data is super exciting and demonstrates the power of CAR T cells, as does the Juno data. So I think you have to keep in mind how sick the patients are in these trials and what their alternatives are when you start looking at these effectiveness data. So if you look at Juno, for instance, your alternative, if you don't get the Juno treatment today, is actually to die. There's almost 100% death rate in the refractory ALL that they're treating. So there is no alternative. And the people that have gotten there have actually gone through treatments in induction chemotherapy that have 10 or 15% death rates. And if they're lucky enough to get a transplant, they may have a 20 or 25% death rate just to get to the point where they get to try a new immunotherapy. So I think we have to keep perspective about risk-benefit here. The cure for cancer is never a linear path. It's all about trying to figure out how to optimize these therapies, and that's why you do clinical trials. But I do think, both the Juno data actually, which you've seen have, anywhere from 60, 70, 80, 90, even 100% CR rates in end-stage cancer. When you think about that, it is still, to me, mind-blowing. I would have no hesitation in putting my family members, if they had these diseases, in those kind of trials, because there are no alternatives. And I think when you see the combined data of Bluebird, Juno, and some of the other CAR T-cells companies, I think it still is an exciting time. And I think when combined with some of the checkpoint, it's all about the T-cells, right? T-cells are really having major impacts on disease, and we're in early days. We're in, we're in the top of the first inning of these things. It's not, it took, I don't know, 30, 40 years to develop bone marrow transplantation down to the point where it has a 25% death rate.
So a lot of the advances in cancer have been not these cells, which are in the beginning of the first inning, but the other immunotherapies, which are infused, which are sold by both Bristol and Merck, Opdivo and Keytruda. One of the big concerns with these, and they're amazing drugs. I mean, one of my favorite examples is that we still have Jimmy Carter around because of Keytruda. It sounded like he was going to be at death's door. He went on Ken's drug, and so far has had really impressive results. But there's been a lot of concern about the cost of these drugs, and particularly, Giovanni, I mean, you've been talking about combining Opdivo with your other immunotherapy, Yervoy, which seems to have amazing results, but we're talking about a list price there of $250,000. So how do we balance the cost and the benefit? There's obviously a huge benefit, but we're also starting to talk about really big numbers in cost. I remember when it was controversial when someone had a $50,000 cancer drug. How do we deal with these prices?
Well, Matt, I think we start from the fact that we are making extraordinary progress. And as you said, the efficacy of immuno-oncology and the checkpoint inhibitors like Opdivo and Keytruda is truly unprecedented. We've been really thinking about patient access and affordability since 2011 when Yervoy was approved as the first checkpoint inhibitor. I think it's a good example to go through what has happened in melanoma in just 5 years, because we were discussing a new technology that is just at the beginning. Let's just think about the revolution that has happened in melanoma in 5 years. In 2011, if you were diagnosed with stage 4 melanoma, you had 5 to 10, maybe 15% probability of being alive 12 months later. We introduced Yervoy. There was a number of patients, between 10-15% of patients responded. We began to see long-term responses. We now have data that shows that 20-25% of patients are alive after 10 years. Just 2 or 3 years later, Opdivo and Keytruda were approved in monotherapy. We raised that bar by more than twofold. And only 1 year later, that standard of care was replaced again. And in only 5 years, we've seen science evolve quickly enough that the standard of care has evolved twice. Now it is the combination of Opdivo and Yervoy. And we're getting 60% response rates. We're getting 20% of patients with a complete response. We talk to patients all the time. I actually have had really the privilege of speaking to so many patients over the last few years. The stories you hear are extraordinary. I just spoke to a physician from Nottingham here at the conference this morning. He was telling me they are, in his center, truly excited to see remissions in 1/3 of the patients they are treating with this regimen. So the value is extraordinary. And we have been working with payers since the beginning. When you show that type of data, there is clearly an openness to providing access to patients. The last thing that I would say is that you also have to really look at the total cost of treating the disease, because the alternative to using a really effective combination regimen is potentially to use 2 lines of therapy and use 2 drugs anyway and generate outcomes for patients that are much less effective. So again, if you think about Yervoy and Opdivo as an example, you have a period of time where the 2 drugs are used together. The cost is only 6% higher than if you were using monotherapy, and only the patients that respond continue. If a patient is responding, the value to society and the cost effectiveness of that regimen is extremely high. So I think it's really important that we continue to focus on providing extraordinary transformational value to patients. We do need to work together. The payers, the providers, the pharmaceutical industry, we are working together to make sure that these regimens are approved. You know that the UK is probably one of the countries that has the toughest health technology assessments methodologies in the world. Is a really rigid system, but I can tell you that that specific regimen is one of the fastest positive opinion they've ever provided, because they saw the value from day one.
So Ken, you've thought about this a lot, obviously. What do you think? There's a big difference between these high efficacy drugs and low efficacy drugs when we're talking about cost and benefit. There's obviously a value here. How do we make sure that we're getting the right value? And how do we make sure that society is paying for it in a way that patients get access?
Well, I think one of the most important things about these discussions and this panel is a good start to the conversation, but there's no patient up here. And there's no patient group up here. And when you start to talk about value, we have to realize that different participants have different perspectives on value. If you're one of these patients that has been discussed this morning, who has no alternative, a newly diagnosed patient with a form of cancer that's responsive to any of these therapies, what's the alternative? Okay, economically, you're talking about hospitalizations, you're talking about surgeries, you're talking about radiation, you're talking about chemotherapy, you're talking about side effects, you're talking about lost work, you're talking about maybe losing your home, you're talking about your family being disrupted. So the natural history of the disease needs to be put up here as the alternative. And I think when you look at the natural history of the disease and you look at the benefit of the drugs, and these drugs, as already has been said with Keytruda and Opdivo, we have unprecedented results, both from the standpoint of efficacy and the standpoint of safety. I think the most important thing for us is to have a holistic view of value and have a holistic view of cost, because when we look at the cost of the natural disease, it's actually cancer we can't afford. And if we can afford to actually, as we've seen economic studies from the University of Chicago, is if we can reduce the cancer death rate by 10%, it's something like worth $4 trillion to us. So I think we've got to look at the whole picture.
But so how do we deal, and anyone who has ideas on this, but how do we deal with this issue as, we're talking about, right now we're really talking about 2 drug combinations. Mm-hmm. But it's very possible, you're doing them, you've had some really impressive chemotherapy data with your PD-1, Ken, but we're really talking about adding a drug to the existing regimen. But it's possible that we'll be doing 2 or 3 or other approaches. Does the current pricing model scale? Some people...
Well, Matt, I think it's important for us to recognize a couple of things. We are sitting here, and I think Mark's comment about HIV is one that we have to remember. We are now at the equivalent stage of where we were when we had the first breakthroughs with HIV drugs, right? So the good news back then was that people didn't inevitably die of HIV anymore. But the work that got done after that to develop new drugs and to understand how these drugs could be used in combination was what allows us now to look at HIV as something that's a chronic manageable disease. Maybe we're not at the top of the first inning with immunotherapy, but we're probably in the bottom of the first inning. So for us to try to sit here today and say, how can we decide on the value of one combination versus the other combination? We're still very early. At Merck, we're running nearly 400 trials with Keytruda right now. The first trials were aimed primarily at registration for these tumor types. We're now getting to studies that allow us to evaluate the quality of life for patients and the healthcare economics that are associated with using Keytruda singly or in combination. And I think it's important for us to recognize that we can't make these decisions either blindly, that is, without data, and we can't make them in isolation without regard to the other costs in the system.
And part of what Ken is talking about is that once we define a therapeutic index for single drugs, combination therapy in cancer, not only do we look for new usage, but the existing space where the drugs are being used, more investigations are done to find out subsets within that quote-unquote homogeneity to look for patients who would otherwise not benefit. So it doesn't end with an FDA or European approval, it begins. You had a panel just before us talking about, for lack of a better description, big data. The toolbox to get at some of what Ken is talking about, where we do N of 1 clinical trials on the backbone of a molecular target, is what will happen over the next 10, 15, 20 years. Big data algorithms will be written on cancer patients to say, guess what? Old platinum-based therapy for lung cancer may actually be the best thing to do because someone's immune system isn't teed up well enough to react with a checkpoint inhibitor. Well, we don't know that today. But we will know that over the next 10 to 15 years because we're building repositories of data and other stakeholders are coming into this discussion to create better value, which in the end, I would define as an outcome per patient. Because the waste in the system, whether it's a patient we don't know will benefit or not from therapy, we take the checkpoint inhibitors, even take the portfolio that Celgene has in myeloma. It is now standard in myeloma, based on data, to get a 3-drug regimen for relapsed refractory multiple myeloma. At list price, that cost approaches $180,000 a year. But the outcomes, empirically, for 90% of patients is a huge advantage in life expectancy, survival. And the access opportunity, as Giovanni already talked about, is there for blood cancer patients who need 3 drugs.
Let me add on a couple of things, Matt, if I may, to what Ken said and Mark. So first of all, I really believe that we are just at the beginning of an extraordinary revolution in the treatment of cancer. You've heard the number of trials that are being run. We have 10 different mechanisms of action. By the end of this year, we will have potentially 12, 13 molecules in early development. And so I think that the progress we will be able to make in finding the right combination for the right patient is just extraordinary. The least cost-effective intervention is really the patient that doesn't respond because he or she have not been given the right therapy. The least effective intervention are the resources that are spent managing side effects that can be avoided. And what we hear from patients is that they not only want to be treated, but they want to keep living and working while they're being treated. So the societal value of moving from chemotherapy to targeted therapies and immuno-oncology interventions that are tailored to patients and allow them to be experiencing deep responses, long-term survival, and go back to work at the same time because of the tolerability of these regimens is just extraordinary for society.
Given what you just said, you made some choices in designing your clinical trials for Opdivo. We don't really know. You had a failure in first-line non-small cell lung cancer. The drug works in second line, where Merck didn't. We don't really know why that is. But one possible explanation was your choice of how heavily to lean on the biomarker, the test, to see if patients would. Are you investing heavily enough in, should you be looking more to strategy of identifying the best responders first?
Absolutely. And I think that the example that you mentioned is a really important example because science in this field moves really fast. And discovering new medicines and bringing them to patients, it's a very risky proposition that often takes a long time and very significant resources. And so, we are at the beginning of understanding how to segment patients and use different mechanisms, different types of immuno-oncology agents. And we're investing very heavily in biomarkers. All of us are investing very heavily on biomarkers. We actually have a level of cooperation with the academia that is unprecedented in translational research, because we are going to have to figure this out together. We're not going to be able to do it everyone on our own in order to do it fast and effectively. And so I think we are learning a lot. We learned a lot from the study that did not succeed.
Just a quick comment as you go to the audience. Remember, Matt, we're talking about the risk of doing clinical trials. We started our session talking about Juno and a little bit of toxicity that has popped up in an early trial. Giovanni, you brought up the first-line non-small cell lung cancer trial. The model, the economic model of drug invention and drug discovery is full of risk. But what we've done as a consequence of that risk is created value for shareholders, for sure. The patient value is inescapable. If you have lung cancer, even with checkpoint inhibitors, for the vast majority of patients, if you have metastatic disease, your life expectancy at 5 years is certainly less than 50%. Prostate cancer is almost a chronic disease where 10 years ago, it would not have been. Myeloma survival has quadrupled in 10 years. When Ken talks about where we would be turning cancer into a chronic disease, we have to understand the long-term view that cost to society, productivity will go up if we continue on this path of exploring immunology to treat cancer. And that's what we're talking about today.
Okay.
But I think-
I want to jump to the audience. They're not going to get a word in. Do we have any questions up there?
Right up there.
Let's go.
Barbara.
Hi, my name is Don Diamond. I work at City of Hope, a nonprofit organization. I've been funded by the NCI for close to 30 years in a variety of different indications. And my question to all of you who have succeeded in various ways to benefit patients, but let's talk about the innovation part, which originally stemmed from basic research in the laboratory, which then translated to small startups in which many of you bought, for instance, Metarex, etc., and then translated to your specialty, which is delivery to a large number of patients. And I don't think anyone would disagree that the role of pharma is to provide for greater numbers of patients. My question is, what is your opinion about the federal responsibility to fund the basic research, which really is fundamental to many of your profit centers today?
Bob, this is really in your wheelhouse.
Well, I mean, I think, that basic research fuels it all, and we all benefit from solid funding of basic research, and that's what fuels all of this stuff. We start companies, they buy them, they partner with them, and that system is integral. And most of the innovation, with all due respect to the pharma guys here, happens in the biotech companies and the academic research organizations, and then kind of passes up through the system. So it's a mutually reinforcing.
Do any of you want to respond to that thought?
I think the public-private partnership around basic research is essential. It's, as you are alluding to, it's the cause of and reason for so much progress. And it's ironic that you bring it up today because Congress is passing through legislation around the 21st Century Cures Act. Yesterday, the House passed it. Hopefully, the Senate will very rapidly pass it. And it provides an additional almost $5 billion for basic research at the NIH. Is it enough? I don't know what that means because we're embarking on so much creativity on the basic research side. But I think it is a recognition that the taxpayer and companies like are represented here have to work together on basic science and also delivery access solutions. That's why this conference is so important, because I believe this is what's happening.
So go ahead.
I was just going to say that I agree 100%. I think, for example, 21st Century Cures was a fantastic thing because it gives us opportunities to fund basic research at NIH and other places. It also allows us to hopefully get things to patients faster. But I also want to say that I think while the ecosystem works very well and the small companies and the startups inevitably have an important role to play when it comes to basic research, a lot of our companies are also devoted to discovery, and a lot of important discoveries do happen in big companies. We need some of those smaller companies, but over the whole arc, we talk about the arc of the natural history of disease. If we talk about the arc of innovation, I can just look at my company and say, there was a period of time when Merck survived on anti-infectives and vaccines, which are still critical in healthcare. That led us to be able to do the antihypertensives, which led us to the cholesterol drugs, which led us to the HIV drugs, which are now leading us to the cancer drugs. So it's important for us to see the natural arc of innovation. And if we start saying, we can't pay for these drugs today, then we know what's going to happen to the arc. It's not going to continue to go this way. And we need cures for Alzheimer's. We need better cures for cancer.
We were talking about HIV earlier. Integrase inhibition for HIV, which is a major newer modality, is entirely or mostly was a Merck thing. It started there, and other companies have followed it, but it didn't actually really bubble up from academia as most drugs probably do. Another question?
David Bates, University of Nottingham. As a basic science researcher and somebody who tries to spin out companies and develop drugs, it's clear that the amount of time taken from identification of the biomarker or identification of the target to develop the drug is getting shorter and shorter, which presumably means that the patent life is extending longer and longer. Does that mean that the return should be shared between academia and pharma more, or does it mean that we should be looking at higher values when we transfer them into pharma?
Yeah, after all, you guys not being able to get your cardiology drugs approved until they only had a few years left. Now you're getting these cancer drugs approved in record time. So,
well, let me maybe give you my perspective. I think that what we are seeing is an extraordinary acceleration of innovation, and I believe that's extraordinarily positive for patients. I think that's good for academia. It's good for the industry. I do also believe that we are seeing a significant shortening on the other side, because I think you need just think about hepatitis C. There have been 4 waves of innovation in the last 5 to 6 years, and the standard of care has changed multiple times at a speed which was unprecedented in some of the areas that Ken referred to. I gave you the example of melanoma, where Yervoy became the standard of care at the end of 2011. It's no longer used in monotherapy. So I think there are multiple considerations, and it's not really an easy equation in thinking about what the acceleration in drug development and improvement in the standards of care mean, because quite frankly, in many diseases, fortunately for patients, it's happening much faster, and the life cycle has changed as well. So I think it's just a much more dynamic field, particularly in oncology, in which hopefully we will continue to raise the bar with new technologies all the time at a speed which I don't think we have seen before.
So I want to ask the three of you a question which is not entirely on topic, but which Brent brought up this morning. He came and announced some additions to some changes to how he's doing his patient assistance program, but has also made a commitment to not taking what he considers large price increases. Roy Vagelos, who I know is a hero to all of us, and particularly to you, Ken, famously took I think a bigger step historically. Is it time for companies in the industry to step up and make some commitments on price before this happens publicly?
So let me start by saying I compliment Brent for the very public position that he's taken. I think, though, that we can't look at the industry as one monolithic industry. So I think that Merck has always tried to be, in the wake of what you just described, very disciplined with respect to price increases. With respect to, for example, patient assistance programs, we've always said, okay, we want to be the industry standard. And on these drugs, we're talking about 5 times the federal poverty level for eligibility. So from my perspective, I think it's important for the industry as a whole to show discipline around pricing. It depends. It's a case-by-case example, as we just finished saying. There are lots of times you're continuing to invest in expanding the drug's utility. And somebody's got to pay for that, but at the same time, these really huge increases where there is no corresponding increase in the benefit, I think, frankly, are foolhardy.
I totally agree with Ken. And we, since the beginning, have placed a very big priority on access to make sure that price was not an issue for any patient that needs one of our products. We also have an extraordinary comprehensive set of support programs. I also would like to say that you need to look at the total cost of treating a disease, because the price of a medicine is really only a component of the price of the ultimate cost of that medicine to a patient. And I think it's important to continue to stress the pharmaceutical industry has a very big role to play, which we've demonstrated by working with payers since the beginning. But I think it's for the entire system to work together. I also believe we do need a more flexible system to be able to price combinations in a way that reflects their value more easily. And so I believe this is a really important dialogue. I think it's clearly one where I believe the innovation-focused industry, and clearly Bristol-Myers Squibb is willing to play a very proactive role, but I think it's a dialogue for many parts of healthcare.
Another question out there?
Barbara in the middle.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Hinkle. I'm a consultant partner at McGivney Global Advisors, and I'm working on many of these access and value issues, specifically in oncology. And my question is about these emerging value frameworks that we've seen, particularly ones like ICER, Institute for Clinical and Economic Review. They've looked at some of the drugs that your companies have over the past year. I've personally been a very outspoken critic of this group. I think that they're not capturing the full picture of value. And my question is, what opportunities exist for pharma and biotech to kind of take back that narrative and talk about value and quantify value in a way that's much bigger than, for example, a cost per quality kind of view, which I think is very limited and short-sighted.
Mark, why hasn't pharma or biotech created its own ICER so that you'd have a voice in this conversation? I mean, it really does seem like the industry has done very little to create a discussion of value until we had to, until you had to.
Yeah, and I think that's a fair point. You know, the marketplace at large forces certain issues to industries, whether it's our industry or some other industry. So let's just set the record straight. We've sort of been kind of pulled to the table, and I think that's a fair criticism. Thanks for bringing this up, because I think it's very, very an important point. Again, it's a constructive narrative. We can disagree, we can agree with methodology, but what we all agree on is how we can more quantify outcomes, value, and then how systems pay for that innovation and value. So for example, one would then have to look and say, well, what does work? We heard from Steve and Express Scripts this morning. A lot of payers around the world are doing this work. Giovanni referenced NICE. NICE is probably the original health economics system by modeling outcomes-based reimbursement. So I think there's a lot of systems in the world that we do participate in, that every day we do publish data that suggests one way or the other that society is benefiting and paying for outcomes. Does one size fit all? I think there's danger in that. I think when we say there's one reference, there's one benchmark, it takes away much of what you've heard this afternoon, this morning, about innovation and changes. Let me give you one simple example. In multiple myeloma, a pill that costs $500 a day can reverse organ dysfunction, starting with kidney failure. Now, the system that you refer to in many of the models can't capture somebody who comes out of or avoids dialysis because their M protein leads to renal dysfunction. Well, if we go into a static outcomes model, how can we ever provide cost effectiveness around that trade-off? The PBM model doesn't recognize that offset. The hospital may or may not recognize that offset. Society clearly is benefiting, but there's nowhere that one can go to say, this is the benefit of that $500 a day pill. So we have to be really careful, but I would argue that we are on this path of doing more and more quantification and objectivity around value for cost. So I appreciate you bringing that up.
So we talked a lot about being in the first or second inning. Bob, I actually would like to close by asking for your thoughts on something, and I kind of know what he's going to say. Where do you think we end up at the end of all these innings? I mean, you spend a lot of time thinking way farther out than these guys really do, because you make such early bets on companies. What do you think cancer looks like in 20 years?
So I think the next wave, I think it'll be an outpatient disease. I think it's going to be early detection with blood-based diagnostics will tell you at stage 0 or even pre-cancer that you're going to get cancer. And we may even intervene at the pre-cancer stage. So I don't think it will necessarily be just even a disease-based model. So I think what's going to happen is you'll see these immunotherapies hit early detection. So you'll be at home, you'll go to your doc, you'll get a blood test. They'll say you have this. We'll know exactly what that is. We will send that information over to a CAR T cell, a cancer vaccine, some subset of small molecules, and you'll go in and get those and go home. And I think those will be highly curative therapies. So I think that's the direction it's going. I think you can tell when you see the results of some of these immunotherapies, they're so unprecedented that when you see CR rates like that, you know that you can do better. And so I think that's why everybody's optimistic about where this is going. You add early detection into that, then it kind of changes everything, because you'll really be using data to drive the decision.
Yeah.
That's
Now,
what I think.
Mark, do you think our system, our drug development system as it is now, is it all prepared to get us to that?
In the context of cancer, absolutely. Well, my colleagues have talked about this evolutionary process of learning, building on experience, understanding science. We can do computational biology today at an unprecedented rate. And 5 years from now, 10 years from now, the ability to understand cancer as a disease will be completely different than it is today in a very meaningful, better way. Think 5, 6 years ago, the literature did not talk about T-cell checkpoint inhibitors. You can look. It's not in the New England Journal of Medicine. It's not in the peer-reviewed literature. Where will this take us 10, 15 years from now? And the evolution of what we're doing, as long as innovation continues to provide the appropriate incentives, right? The appropriate incentives, that innovation is valued, that some of the things we talked about today were the outlier. Brent mentioned that earlier today. The outlier isn't a representation of what we've talked about in the last half hour. As long as the system is allowed to innovate and incentives are appropriately aligned, we will cure certain cancers in the next 20 years. We will certainly take a lot of acute treatment, and Bob mentioned this, or acute cancers, and turn them into chronic diseases. Can we make cancer like diabetes? I think the answer is absolutely yes.
Let's stop right there. Thank you very much. This is a great panel. Thanks to all of you. See you again soon.
Ladies and gentlemen, we will now take a 20-minute break. Our program will resume at 10:30 a.m. Thank you.